Well, I believe it is 4 o'clock here in the Eastern Standard Time Zone, and we are going to gather again. And I appreciate any who have taken the time and exerted the energy to join with us as we once again just continuous study in the Passion Week of Jesus. And last week we've had 2 sessions already, and the last session uh, I made the point that there are a couple of events which I think are hugely important in setting the scene, setting the stage for the Passion Week of Jesus biblically. The Bible traces these, it seems to me, or connects these very deliberately. And the first happened in Perea, when on the other side of the Jordan River, where Jesus had gone because his life was threatened in Jerusalem. And so he had made his way over to Perea, and in so doing, he had fled from the jurisdiction of Pilate, where the Jewish leaders could persuade Pilate to do their bidding. He had fled to the jurisdiction of Herod Antipas. And while he was there in Perea, matter of fact, I will quickly get a map, sort of a primitive map. But again, just to rehearse this, Jerusalem, of course, is here and in Judea, and Perea is yonder. And of course, Perea and Galilee belonged to a man named Herod Antipas, and Samaria and Judea were under the jurisdiction of a man named Pilate. So again, Jesus had fled to Perea. It was largely non-Jewish and Gentile territory, but he had fled there to escape, John 10, verse 40, from the anger of some of the Jewish leadership. And he while he was there, there were some Pharisees that we talked about last week. There were some Pharisees who came and tried to trick him back into Jerusalem. And he refused to come, but he said, "You'll not see me." This is Luke chapter 13 and verse 34. He had said, I'm going to go there just quickly as long as it can be done. Luke 13 and verse 34, Jesus had made a staggering promise. And he had said that you shall not see me. Excuse me for all this. I've just got done teaching another class. But this is where he says in the yellow, you shall not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that is a quote from Psalm 118, which is very much a psalm of messianic inauguration. And it was a psalm that God gave to teach Israel how to receive her Messiah. And she was taught to cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. This is the day which the Lord has made. Only he could have done this. We will rejoice. Well, Jesus says, you'll not see me until you sing that psalm at my arrival. That is to say, you'll not see me until you welcome me as Messiah. Now, this is the point that we made last week. I'm going to make it again here. And I'm just warning you, it won't be until Friday, because we meet again on Friday, that I'll try and draw it all together and answer the question I'm going to put to you. But the point that I made was that if you were there on that day, that is, if you were there in Perea on that day when Jesus made that stunning promise to the Pharisees as representative of Jerusalem, you'll not see me until you welcome me as Messiah. Had you been there, you would have said, that's not going to happen. These leaders are angry with him. He is not going to be received as Messiah. But we know the rest of the story. We know that just a few weeks later, he did, in fact, ride into the city. And what we remember is the triumphal entry. And that's where we're headed, because that's the commencement of the Passion Week. But how did that happen? Or better yet, what did Jesus do to cause that to happen? Because I believe he did. And he did it because he was wise as a serpent and harmless as a dove. So the promise is in Luke 13 and verse 34. You'll not see me until you cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The drama that really sets the stage and where we want to go next is the raising of Lazarus. So the first of those incidents, as I have on the screen here, is this promise that Jesus makes in John 13. On the other hand, there is another event which is hugely important in terms of setting the groundwork, and that is the raising of Lazarus. And so that's where I want us to go next, the raising of Lazarus. And of course, we find that record only in John. Now, let me just say real quickly, more or less in passing, that I'm doing too many things here. Let me just say that this is only recorded. John 11 records the raising of Lazarus. I have, by the way, on the screen, the Logos Bible software. And so the notes and so on are a function of the Logos Bible software. I love it. It's a tremendously effective and helpful program. But the point is that John tells us this story. Now, folks, just a bit of an aside. John is the last gospel written. He's the standalone gospel. He's the which one of these is not like the other gospel. The other are synoptics. They tend to see the same thing. And I'm persuaded that that is because John is writing late. He knows that his listeners already have Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or Matthew, Luke, and Mark, if you don't mind. In other words, he knows that they are in possession, and he expects them to be familiar with the synoptics, and he builds on the synoptics, and he supplements those gospels and so on. But John is writing, I am persuaded, to address a remarkable explosion of disbelief in the largely Jewish Christian world of the late first century. And I think it's very possibly an explosion, a crisis of disbelief that was precipitated by a change in leadership in a very important Jewish conference called the Sanhedrin, or the Yavnei Academy. And all of a sudden, a step was taken to drive the believing Jews, that is the Messianic Jews, Jews who had claimed Jesus as Messiah, had hitherto been warmly received in their synagogues, but now they're being driven out. And all of a sudden, there's a deep price to be paid for embracing Jesus as Messiah, and therefore there are many who are going back. And it's curious that John in his purpose statement says, John 20 and verse 31, many other signs did Jesus in the presence of the apostles, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And what's often acknowledged as curious about that is that although he says that he is writing in order that people might believe, in fact, the stories that he writes includes so much more of disbelief and staggering, stunning disbelief. And one of the most stunning is the story before us, John 11. Now, let me just put a ribbon on what I was talking about a minute ago. The point is, I am persuaded that John is writing to address that crisis of disbelief, which has erupted over the fact that all of a sudden it costs you something to confess Jesus as Messiah, especially in the Jewish world. And John's tactic is not to write some stories about miracles in the hope that his readers will simply say in response to that miracle, well, what must I do to be saved? John knows better than that. John's not that naive. John knows that Jesus, his Savior, had said that if a man comes back from the dead, you have Moses and the prophets, and if you won't believe those, then if a man comes back from the dead, you won't believe. So John is not naive enough to think he can simply write some miracle stories and people will be stumbling over one another to get saved. John's purpose in writing his gospel, I'm persuaded, is to unmask the true character of disbelief. And so you get just a crescendo of staggering disbelief. And it kind of comes full. I mean, the last story to make this point was John 9. And that was the story of a man born blind, who when he was healed, was hauled before the Jewish authorities, and they tried to get him to confess he had never been blind. I love that man born blind. I'm anxious to meet him. He's a man with a genuine chutzpah. But you'll remember perhaps that in his conversation with the authorities, he says to him, because they say, you are following him, we're following Moses, we don't know where he is from. And the man in John 9, I'm just rehearsing the story briefly, says, well, here is an amazing thing. And I think his point is, up until a moment ago, I'd have told you that the most amazing thing I ever encountered was my sight. I'll show you something even more amazing. Here is an amazing thing, your blindness. Ever since the beginning of time, it's not been heard that a man could open the eyes of the blind, and yet here's a man who does that, and you say he doesn't know, we don't know where he's from. And of course, ultimately, they do in fact toss him out of the synagogue, which is a horrible thing. Now, my point is that what jumps off the page about that story is the staggering unbelief. And now we get the final story in this crescendo that John is developing. And it is, in fact, the story of Lazarus. Now, let me just say that I'm just going to tell the story rather quickly, and then I'm going to go to the passage and pick up on some things. But as a matter of fact, let me take you to that map once again, because this, again, it's very important for you to understand. And let me say that the reason I'm going to spend this session with Lazarus and this story is because biblically, according to John in his gospel, it is so very, very preparatory. In so many ways, it sets the stage for what we're going to see next week, but in our next session. But you need to understand this, that Bethany, Lazarus and his sisters live in a village called Bethany. Now, it is a village, it's unwalled. It is on the backside or the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives. So here you have Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is identified 3 times in the Old Testament as a mountain which lies, Jerusalem 3 times we're told of a mountain which lies on the east side of Jerusalem, and it's called the Mount of Olives, not that long, but there is a high hill. Most of the mountains in the Bible, frankly, are high hills. And there is a hill about 2,700 feet high, higher than Jerusalem by about 300 feet, and it lies on the east of Jerusalem. So in order to get down to Jericho, down to the Dead Sea, for instance, you have to leave Jerusalem, cross over the Mount of Olives and down the eastern slope to Jericho, and then across to Perea. Well, the point to be made here is simply that Bethany is a village just outside of Jerusalem on the eastern side, and that's where Lazarus lives. And Jesus is still over here in Perea. That's where we left him after that confrontation in Luke chapter 13 with the Pharisees, after he made that promise. But now a messenger comes. And that messenger says, the one whom you love is sick. And so let me take you to the passage itself. John chapter 11, you have, it says, a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany. And this is so fascinating to me. I got to stop on it. Some of you will find this perhaps interesting. Forgive the slight rabbit trail. But John stops to say, it was that Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Now, what's curious about this is that John is going to tell that story in the next chapter. But John knows that his readers are familiar with the synoptics. And 2 of the 3 synoptics, Matthew and Mark, tell that story about Mary anointing Jesus. And so John realizes that his readers are going to be saying, now, is that the same Mary? And so John says, yes, this is the same Mary, that even though he hasn't yet told that story, this happens before that story happens. And so that's going to happen. He's going to tell that story in the next chapter. But at any rate, and that's just another, that sentence in the yellow is just another illustration, which I think is helpful and important, even in sometimes dealing with the Gospel of John, understanding it, that he is so careful to synchronize his gospel with the other 3. I believe very strongly in what is sometimes called the fourfold gospel approach to gospel studies, which is to say, you don't have four independent tellings that don't know anything. They are independent of each other. They're not copying from one another, but by the same token, under the Spirit of God, they are written in such a way as to together give us exactly the story we need to have. It's a fourfold telling of the gospel. And each gospel is distinct and a book unto itself. Amen and amen. But at any rate, John's interaction here is important. But at any rate, so the sisters sent a messenger, and they said simply, Lord, behold, the one whom you love is sick. Now, when Jesus heard this in verse 4, he said, well, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And it's interesting that John stops and he says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, Jesus stayed 2 more days in the place where he was. And after this, he said, we need to return to Judea. Now I want to stop on that part of the story for just a moment, and I want to make 2 comments. And one is this, that folks, I said in the first session that it is so desperately important to take very seriously the real humanity of Jesus, to realize he is living a real life. And I think that I even recommended that as you read the various stories of Jesus' life, the very various passages, pericopes, events, that you, as much as in you is, you conceive of that story as unfolding within the limitations of unfallen humanity. There are places where the Spirit of God does enable Jesus to know supernaturally, but don't get the idea that he lives his whole life in exercising that sort of omniscient knowledge. It's when the Spirit enables him. Well, let me just say that this is one of those places where I think, and I'm not at all reluctant to do so, I think that clearly the Spirit of God, if you don't mind, has whispered in Jesus' ear. I like to use that phrase because that's what the chronicler tells us in 1 Samuel chapter 9, that the prophet Samuel, as he encountered Saul, I won't go back to the story, but it simply says that God whispered in his ear. And certainly God did and could communicate that way with a prophet when it was necessary. And Jesus was a prophet because Jesus seems to know well that Lazarus is dead. And he seems, because he says, the sickness is not unto death. Now, by the time he said that, quite clearly, Lazarus was dead, because he's going to wait 2 days and then he's going to make his way back into Judea. And it's not a 2-day trip, no more than a 2-day trip. And by the time he gets there, Lazarus has been dead 4 days. So most likely Lazarus is already dead. But he's going to rise again. And that's what Jesus means when he says Jesus is going to raise him from the dead, when he says the sickness is not unto death. But I lose my way. The point is that Jesus, one of the most curious statements in this story is, in fact, right here, where we read that when he heard, because he loved Martha, so therefore, when he waited 2 days. So now, if he loved him so desperately, why did he wait 2 days? Well, let me just say that we know dead sure that by reason of those 2 days, when he got to the tomb, Lazarus had been dead 4 days. Now we're going to come to this, but this is Martha's horrified protestation. No, he's been dead 4 days. So by the time Jesus arrived, Lazarus had been dead for those 4 days. All right, so I got to be quick. Let's talk for a minute about the way they would bury in that day, what burial, funeral practices, and so on were like. And I like to tell people, learn to read the Bible in terms of its own culture. The Bible is not a culture-bound book. It will work in any culture. It is a culture-based book. And you are so well advised to learn to read it in terms of its own culture. Get to know that it's different than ours. So get to know that culture. Now, just as a little recommendation, 2 areas of life that I would really encourage you to get to know, and I mean study, get books about this and so on. It's so accessible, this culture is. But two areas you might begin studying are marriage and burial. And the reason I say it is because they are so central to life and they show up in the narrative so often, both in events and narratives and word picture and so on. It's so important. And they are so different than in our culture. So let me start with burial. In this culture, when a person dies, especially a wealthy person, and I am mildly persuaded that cave burials were a lot more common than some think, but even for the poor, but this was a rich man, and we know he had a cave. So when a man of this stature died, his body would be attended to for 3 days. Now, this is very important. There is nothing more important in Jewish culture than properly attending to the body of someone you love who has died. And this shows up again and again. The opposite is true. If you want to demonstrate contempt for a person, you defile his body after he has died. You take the body of Saul and his sons and haul them way down to Beit Shan and hang them on the wall. It's so important. And the procedure was basically this. When they would dig a tomb out of a rock, in other words, when they would dig a cave tomb, and generally they were man-made, and you built with limestone in that part of the world, and so oftentimes you need a family tomb, and these tombs would be used generation after generations, and sometimes century after century, reused again and again. But the point is that you would very deliberately, maybe you're going to build a building or just a wall, and you can do it from fieldstone, but it would be a much more secure and solid structure if, in fact, you dug out ashlars. So you shaped ashlars. So you go in and you start to dig out the ashlars, but you do, as you do so, you leave behind a usable space. And if that space is going to be a tomb, it might be an animal pen, such as, I believe, where Jesus was born. But on the other hand, if it was going to be a tomb, and there are many of these, and these are what are called Second Temple tombs because it's the days of Jesus, the New Testament, the first century. But a Second Temple tomb, I was just reading about one just the other day that was discovered above the Hinnom Valley. Is actually discovered in 2009, but I was just reading the article about it. But the point is that, number one, you would have shelves, tables. So you'd carve the tomb with tables, and those tables, that's where you would lay the body of the person who had died. And then you would also include, and there were variations on this theme, but you would have shafts, because in the Second Temple period or the first century, oftentimes, rather than taking the bones and putting them in a pit, which was done in the Old Testament, in the First Temple period, they would scoop the bones up and put it in a box called an ossuary, and these have come into the news in several ways lately, and then you'd slip it into a shaft. Now, the point is that when a person died, you would bring him into the tomb, and you would wash his body, and depending upon his wealth, you would perhaps wrap it in some sort of linen shroud, but then you would simply wrap his body in cloth. And it might just be the garment he was wearing. But you would just take cloth and you would rip it in long strips and you would soak it in perfumed water. And then you would wrap his body. Now, you would wrap his body. It was not mummifications. That's very important. The Jews did not and do not make any attempt to retard decay. They didn't embalm, but the thing is, and this is what you need to understand, they wanted to be able to attend to the body. And as soon as a person dies, very quickly, that body, especially if there's no attempt at embalming, that body begins to smell, and it gets very, very powerful very quickly. And so there was only a certain amount of time, and the reason they would wrap him in the perfumed cloths was primarily to keep the smell down. You're in a small space, a little cave, and and now, by the way, just because you may be wondering about it, there may be another relative who died 6 months ago, and he's lying on a shelf because, all right, I didn't make this point earlier, forgive me. You would lay the body there for a year, and at the end of the year, when the decomposition was pretty thorough and the desiccation was thorough, you would come nothing but bones. You would come in and you would scoop that up and put it into the box, into the ossuary, and then put it into one of those locular shafts or some close variation on that. Now, there might be somebody else who died 6 months ago, and that corpse is in some state of decay, and yet you're going to have a funeral in the same tomb. Yeah, you just take some animal skins and you lay it over it, you air it out and so on, clean it out, because you got to have another funeral. You're going to use this again and again. But more to the point, it's you want to be part of this. Now, remember that if you do, in fact, come and participate and maybe take some of that cloth and wrap it around the stiffening body of your loved one, you're going to render yourself unclean. And you're going to have to go to the temple. You have to wait a certain amount of days. You have to go to the temple and carry out all the rites of purification. But you do it because it's so important to honor one whom you love who has died. And so as soon as he dies, the word goes out and people make their way as quickly as they can. So here's the point. For 3 days, you can wrap the body. At the end of the 3rd day, and might I say that doesn't matter what time of day he dies, but he dies on this day, the next day, the 3rd day. At the end of the 3rd day, you close the tomb, you seal it. Now, when I talk about sealing the tomb, you may be thinking of Pilate's sealing the tomb of Jesus, of the Sanhedrin asking him to seal. Well, that's a different thing. You roll the stone and you put some sort of wax block that can't be removed. That is, you can't open the tomb without breaking that, and then you put a signet ring in there. That's something entirely different, unusual. What I'm talking about is after 3 days, you roll the stone, and the cave will always be dug. I mean, the standard was to dig it with a low opening as an entrance. If you take opening and entrance, you get epening. But the point is that, so you have a stone that is manageable, because you want to roll that stone across the mouth of the cave on the 3rd day, and then you leave him there to decay until a year later, when you indeed scoop up the bones. Now that's Jewish burial. And when you roll the stone, because one other thing, and this is important, it's important because it's different than what we do. The Jewish people, there were sometimes some necropoloi, as they call them, sort of areas where they would have some family tombs, but many times it would be in your own property. If you had for instance, when Jesus was crucified, it says near the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. Now, in the Bible, a garden is a farm, okay? So it's not a rose garden with nice petals and paths. It's a working agricultural installation. But it says near the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden was a farm. In the garden was a tomb. Well, you're thinking that's strange. No. That's what you would do. This is a family tomb. And if you had a place where you could, the side of a hill where you could dig a family tomb, that's what you would do. But in many cases, such as that, you would do it in a place where you lived. It wasn't out somewhere by itself. So the point is that the primary purpose of the stone, people will say, well, it's to keep the animals out. Okay, maybe a little bit, but there was no question in the mind of anybody that body was going to decay, whether it be worms and insects or decay, whatever it does. So they're not trying to protect the body. They know that's going to happen. They're trying to keep the smell in there. The smell becomes awful. And so they would roll that small, I say small, the one that I'm familiar with that you see over in Jerusalem is about, over actually on the road coming down toward Megiddo from Mount Carmel, is a stone of about, I reckon it's about 3.5 feet in diameter. It's about yay wide, but it would take a couple of guys. And you remember the women going out to attend to Jesus' body on Sunday morning, says, who can help us with the stone? It was a job, but you could do it. But they would roll that in place, and then they would take mud and pebbles and chicken in just to keep the smell in. All right, now that's burial. Now let's go back to the story. And remember now, on the 3rd day, you seal the tomb. You close the door, and there's no more preparation. Now let me take you back to the text itself. And again, so it's so interesting to me that Jesus says that loved him so much that he tarried 2 days. Now I'll come back to that in just a moment. But there is so much instruction even in this conversation with the disciples. So notice, so it says here in verse 7, he says, let us go to Judea again. They had left Judea because it was dangerous. And the disciples said, Rabbi, lately, just John 10, you can read it yourself. Okay, they didn't say that, but lately the Jews sought to stone you, and are you going there again? Now Jesus insists that the time is right, and he has to work while the day is there. And so finally, and he says, this Lazarus is asleep, and he uses a metaphor, and the disciples misunderstand it. Well, he's probably getting better then if he's actually able to sleep. And Jesus says, no, no, Lazarus is dead. And he says, I'm glad for your sakes that I wasn't there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Now, I want you to see Thomas's response, because he says, I have it in yellow here. Thomas shrugs his shoulders and he says, well, let's go die with him. That's how dangerous it was for Jesus to go to Jerusalem, to go to the region of Jerusalem, in this case, Bethany, just outside. The Jewish authorities are very, very angry with Jesus. They have already come over with murder in their hearts, trying to lure him back so they can be done with him. And Thomas recognizes this. But as Jesus said, it was time for him to do this. This was the Father's purpose. So he came, and you know the story, how, and I love this exchange, but I'm going to go quickly, how Martha comes out. Now, we don't know exactly how far from the house the tomb was. It undoubtedly wasn't right there, because generally, even in a village, now you were not allowed to have tombs inside of a walled city, but even in a village, the tombs would be on the ring of the, most everybody who lived in a village had some pasture land, because everybody had animals and so on. So you could keep them maybe in pens by the house, but you had to have pasture land, and it might be in just the pasture land around the city that Lazarus had some land, and he had carved a cave tomb. So again, think of a small village. Well, it's not all that small, but just a little village that, and people could have come, and again, well, I'll come back to that. So Jesus comes, and Martha is the first one to hear, and she comes out and remonstrates him. If you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. And Jesus says, of course, it's interesting. Matter of fact, I got to stop. Jesus said to Jesus, Lord, if you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. That's an interesting statement. But even now, I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give you. She hadn't given up hope. Now, remember what she said there. If you'd have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But at any rate, then Jesus says, no, your brother's going to rise again. And she says, well, I know in the resurrection, but I want him now. And Jesus says, no, I am the resurrection and the life. And then she says this. Well, I'll just read it. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Now, this is a really, really pregnant statement on the part of Jesus. Because on the one hand, in the terms of Lazarus, he's going to live again physically. But it is profoundly, and I think this is Jesus' primary point, it is profoundly real and important that the person who believes in Jesus will never know the kind of death that is really at the heart of what death is all about. I will probably say this to you later, but I'll just say quickly that when you and I think about death, we think immediately about physical death. Well, that's real. And it's an enemy, and we live in a season where we're seeing too much of it by reason of the present crisis and so on. And I usually find wherever I am that I'm the oldest guy in the room, and I'm closer than anybody. So yeah, it's a real issue, physical death. But that's not death in the Bible. It is. It's part of it. But what's really at stake, the first time we encounter death in the Bible is Genesis 3. And it's where God says to Adam, don't eat of the tree, because why? In the day you eat it, you will die. So he eats it, lives 938 years, and dies, right? No. In the moment he ate it, in the day that he ate it, and I know the infinitive construct, it doesn't mean you'll start to die and it'll take a long time. It means you shall surely die. In the day you eat it, you shall surely die. And the fact is that the moment he ate it, he died. He had known what it was to walk in the cool of the day with God himself. Adam had known that perfect, beautiful, pure fellowship with his maker that God intended us to know. But now he finds himself alienated from God, separated from God. God has judicially disfellowshipped him, if you don't mind. And now he has the heaviness, the unspeakable heaviness of knowing that he is alienated from God. That's spiritual death, and it's the real issue at stake. It's the first time we encounter it, and now to be sure, because he's denied access to the tree of life, decay begins to happen, and the time comes some years later when he physically dies. Yes, that's a part of the curse, but I will argue that physical death is really a biblical afterthought. The real issue is spiritual death, alienation from God. And that's what Jesus has in mind. The one who believes in me, though he may die, he still is alive. And if he lives and believes in me, he'll never die. That is, he can have the confidence that he is never going to be separated from God. Well, that's how I understand that verse. It's I think hugely significant. But what I want you to see is that he asks Mary, "Do you believe this?" And she said to him, "Yes, Lord." Now watch this. "I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." Now, folks, I'm going to come back to this another time, but this is one of 3 times where you have explicit reference to this twofold faith demand that Jesus made. What Jesus demanded that men accept concerning him is his claim, number 1, to be the Messiah, the long-awaited deliverer of Israel, and number 2, his claim to be God come in the flesh. Now, let me just say that to a degree that it is hard for us to appreciate, these 2 claims are stunningly incredible. Now, I always say, I'm having fun here, but I may be the only guy that I know who knows how to use the word incredible, because everybody uses the word incredible. I don't, but I'm fussy. But everybody uses the word incredible to mean swell. Oh, that was an incredible, people say, that was an incredible sermon. Wouldn't it be just as good for a sermon to be credible? See what I'm saying? Incredible means something. And I'm not getting after you. We're all going to use the term that way. But honest to goodness, I'm using the word very technically. When I say that Jesus' claims were incredible, I mean what the word is intended to mean. They were unworthy of belief. They were beyond belief. And that's what it means. And so I come back to me. The point is that Jesus made 2 claims. He claimed to be the Christ. That was difficult to believe, beyond what we can appreciate, because they were looking for a warrior Messiah. They so desperately wanted a conquering Messiah, and they had good biblical reason to look for a warrior Messiah, because that's exactly what the Bible promises them, their Bible. But it also says that that Messiah will come as a suffering Messiah, and that's what they refused to see. But I'm saying that the claim to be Messiah was incredible because it was disappointing. The claim to be God come in the flesh was incredible because it was blasphemous, because it was unthinkable. Now, let me just stop on this for a minute. I may have mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to say again, you and I have gotten a little bit accustomed to the idea of the God-man, the Word becoming flesh. But imagine standing as a Jewish person in the first century and being confronted, I think I talked to you about this before, by a human being. He doesn't have a halo, he doesn't glow in the dark, but he is claiming to be God come in the flesh. That is staggering. Now, I'll come back to this another time, but I just want to say here that this is what Jesus demanded that men accept concerning him. They bow the knee to this twofold claim. Now, let me tell you where we find it. We find it here in John 13 and John 11, and it's really interesting to me because it's so spontaneous. Jesus, in this very emotionally supercharged moment, Martha comes and says, if you'd have been here, you wouldn't have died. No, he's going to live again. I am the resurrection. Do you believe this? And what explodes, this is not a carefully crafted, well thought through doctrinal statement. It's an emotional reaction. It's an emotional explosion. And he says, do you believe this? Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God who is coming, the Christ, the Son of God. When Jesus gets his disciples alone in Caesarea Philippi, he says, who do you say that I am? I believe that thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then when Jesus is on trial before Caiaphas. I'm sorry. I just had a thought. I think maybe I talked about this before, but you bear with me. Caiaphas says, tell us plainly, are you the Christ, the Son of the living God? But then most importantly, John, in his purpose statement that I referenced before, John 20 and verse 31 says, many other signs did Jesus. These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing you might have life through his name. So it's just interesting that here in this verse, as one of the places, we just encounter this explicit expression that what Jesus demanded, that now let me just say make one other point, that given the fact that these two claims concerning Jesus claims concerning himself are so desperately difficult to believe, and B, given the fact that if you don't believe them, John 20 verse 31, you're lost. You only have life through his name if you believe these. I think it's fair to say that God is under some moral obligation to take those incredible claims and render them not only credible, worthy of belief, but compelling, so convincingly worthy of belief that if you reject them, God can justly condemn you for eternity. This is an important issue. So I'm going to say it one more time. These are incredible claims. And if you refuse to believe them, you're lost. So what did God do to make those incredible claims not only credible, but compelling? I think there are two strategies. Number one is the Old Testament prophecies. So many prophecies that could not be counterfeited. And if you were willing, as many were, to do the Berean thing, I like to call it. Remember the Bereans, when Paul got to the city of Berea, they were more noble because they searched the scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, to see if what he was telling them about the Nazarene were true. And God gave this witness from the past that can't possibly be counterfeited. And again, when people actually checked what the Old Testament said, I have a friend, and I'd call his name, but I might tell the story a little wrong. He's a tremendously important teacher and scholar, but he tells the story of how his mother got saved. He was very, very Jewish home, and he was dead set against it, and she just gave him. He said she begged him. She said, "I'm asking you. You've never read your own scriptures. Read the scriptures. You know enough about who Jesus is that." You tell me if you don't find Jesus in your scriptures. He did, and he got saved. Today he's a wonderful Jewish Christian scholar. And so you have that Old Testament a prophetic revelation that could not be counterfeited. There's no way to jerry-rig this. And yet, in so many ways, it foretells Jesus. And the other strategy, the other divine strategy, is miracles. This is what God does. He vindicates a man's claim to be a divine messenger by miracles. And so Jesus comes and he fulfills these prophecies and he does all these miracles, and one by one, and even including the apostles, they're confronted with, wait, this man claims to be God come in the flesh. Isn't that blasphemy? You know what? It is blasphemy unless it just happens to be true. And in this case, it was true. And so as they go to the scriptures and they do the Berean thing and they see that, wait, it does foretell this man. And then they look at his miracles. Now remember that miracles, the ability to do genuine, no kidding around, muscled up, top drawer, blue ribbon, hair on their chest, miracles, okay? Not clever things, but miracles. The ability to do that can only be God given. On the other hand, it may be that God allows a person to do miracles, Revelation 13, Deuteronomy 13, look at those two passages, because he's testing people. And God gave a negative disqualifying test. He actually gave a number of them, but one of the most important is this, that if the man speaks anything contrary to what God has already said, then even though he can do a miracle, he's a liar and he's to be stoned. Now that's Deuteronomy 13, read it, it's explicit. And so the point is, when Jesus comes and does these miracles and fulfills these prophecies, and you go back and you see that everything he is teaching you is absolutely consistent with what the Hebrew scriptures say, you have no choice. And those incredible claims have been rendered not only worthy of belief, credible, they're compelling, because nobody could counterfeit this. Nobody could do those miracles. And so this matrix, or this construct is hugely important. So I wonder. Now let's get back to the Passion Week of Jesus. This is going to become very important, that set of ideas that I just shared with you in later lessons. But at any rate, so what happens is that Mary comes out. She hears that the teacher has come, and so she comes out. And when she does, the people who had been commiserating with her come with her. And so she comes out here in verse 32. Mary came, Jesus saw, and look at this. And she said, watch this, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. It's kind of stunning, word for word. I think they may have had this conversation before Jesus showed up. But at any rate, Jesus sees her weeping, and the Jews came with her and so on. And he groaned in his spirit and was troubled. And this is connected to the weeping of the Jews. And he said, and this is an interesting illustration, I've used it before, I think, with you, of his genuine unfallen humanity that he had to learn. And so he asked, where have you laid him? Where's the tomb? She takes him to the tomb, and notice that it says once again, verse 35, of course, very short verse, Jesus wept, not the shortest verse in the Greek Testament, but that is in the English to be sure. And but once again, it says Jesus groaning in himself. As a matter of fact, it says that the Jews, these are the Jewish leaders, I think, who had come out to commiserate and, quite frankly, to hope that they could get a healthy offering. But and they remonstrate. They say among themselves, couldn't he have solved this? And Jesus, again, groaning in himself, came to the tomb. There was a real heaviness in the heart of Jesus. I think because he loved Lazarus, but he knew he was going to pray and ask the Father to raise Lazarus. But beyond that, I think just this display of what is probably largely self-serving despair and sorrow and so on. Well, I'll come back to that. Let me go to the story. What happens is Martha. Oh, I'm sorry. Right here. This is what I want. They came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. This is the fourth day, so the stone is secure. And Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And of course, Martha, who was Little Miss Homemaker, and it would be a real social faux pas to submit your friends who have come to commiserate with you to the kind of stench that's going to come rolling out, that death stench that's going to come rolling out. And she's horrified. And she says, Lord, by this time, there's a stench. She's been dead 4 days. You can't do this. Jesus insists. And they took away the stone from the place where the dead man was lying. Now, let me just build on this. I think there are two reasons for which it is important. Well, let me back up. I would argue that Jesus, by the Spirit's direction, tarried for 2 days because he timed his steps so that when he got there, Lazarus would have been dead 4 days. You got to do something with the fact that he loved her so much that he tarried for 2 days. And I think he tarried for 2 days because he knew, I think probably by the Spirit's informing him, that Lazarus, because this is very key to the whole story. So he shows up. Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. The cave is sealed. And now he says, roll away the stone. Now, I think the 4 days are important on two counts. Number one is that there is a cycle of mourning, sitting Shiva, it's called today, but there is a very well-defined cycle of M-O-U-R, mourning in Jewish culture. And the weekly cycle, the high day of the first week, you start counting the day he dies, and the high day of mourning is the fourth day. And if you are only going to get out there on 1 day, you're probably going to go visit the family and share their sorrow on the fourth day. So the crowd's going to be large. Now, you will perhaps recall, and we'll talk about this in later sessions, but when Jesus is pronouncing those woes upon the Pharisees in Matthew 23, one of those woes is, you devour widows' houses. And there's no Hansel and Gretel going on there, if you know what I'm saying. What's at stake is that when a person would die, the authorities, the Jewish leaders, would often descend upon that Jewish house in the hopes that they could extract a lot of money. And Jesus characterizes them as famous for this. And I think a lot of that's what caused him to groan in his spirit, as he realized that there was so much selfishness and shallowness in this mourning. But nonetheless, they were there. But at any rate, he knew he would have the biggest crowd on the fourth day. But the second reason is this, and it's what I've already talked about, folks. The body could be attended to for just 3 days. And as the sun went down on the third day, which was last night in our story, the tomb has to be sealed. That is, the stone is rolled across the door and chinked in order to keep the smell in. And so it's been several hours, it's been several days, but now it's been several hours when that body has been decaying in that tomb. And I think the point is this, that when they rolled the stone away, there's absolutely no way it could be otherwise. That stench came rolling out of there. And the point to be made is simply this, and it was powerful. I think there were probably people backing up kind of away from it and putting their, covering their nose. And when that stench get in your mustache, get in your eyes. And there were probably people go, oh, man, oh. The point is that stench cannot be counterfeited. There's no way in creation that you can counterfeit that stench, which means what? This man was really, really dead. Now, that is absolutely pivotal to this story, and there is to this day, and I grow so weary of it, the horribly jejune and silly, that's what jejune means, I guess, explanation that really these poor primitive people, they didn't know whether people were dead or alive. He was probably in a coma, and they didn't realize it, and so they buried him, and he comes hopping out 3 days. No. The fact is, number one, these people were so much brighter than we give them credit, than we are. They could tell a dead person. There might be some wildly strange thing, but in the course of things, they could tell when a person was dead. But besides that, you can't. I think that's why it was to put the lie to that sort of story, even in that day. See, this miracle is going to spread throughout the land, and it's going to set the stage. And if there were any, do you think they couldn't have come up with that explanation in that day? Do you think somebody said, wow, that was amazing, but I figured, yeah, he must have just been fainted, and they didn't realize he was okay. No, you can't make that case because of the stench. That's why Jesus waited until the fourth day. And so now Jesus, that stench rolls out, and Jesus prays to the Father and simply says in verse 43, Lazarus, come forth. I always say he's bound hand and foot. Says that. He came out bound and hand and foot, and his face was wrapped in a cloth. So I don't know. He probably had to stumble off that bench, and he's hopping out, and Jesus says, cut him loose. Some people have suggested if they didn't cut him loose with that face wrapped, he might have suffocated, and Jesus had to do the whole thing again. I don't know about that. But let me tell you something, folks. You go to a funeral, and as you leave that day, the guest of honor is at the garden gate, and he's saying, thanks for being here. It was good having you. Now, listen, you're going to go home talking about that. And that's where I want to take you. Because John, in typical fashion, and I've left myself insufficient time, but we'll do what we can here. John, in very typical fashion, not only tells us the story in some detail, but he tells us the results. And this is setting this up. All right, I'm asking the question, how did Jesus contrive to fulfill that promise that he made to the Pharisees? You're not going to see me until you welcome me as Messiah. Now, a big part of it, and the Father was behind this, of course, was contriving this providentially, this circumstance where Lazarus has died. Now Jesus, by, I think, direction of the Spirit, tarries for 2 days. When he shows up, the body has been rotting for 4 days. Now that stench comes rolling out, nobody can deny. And now he calls Lazarus out of that tomb, and nobody can deny that Jesus has called that man back from the dead. Now, as a result, here are 3 results. So here's what I started to say. I'm asking the question, how did it happen that the city welcomed Jesus? And a big part of it is right here, and I'll show you why. Because let me say, first of all, and I'd love to have time with this. I didn't give myself enough time. But suffice it to say, this is what happens. In verse 45, some of the Jews, and I think John is using the word Jews here to refer to the leadership. But however you take that, some of the Jews who had come and had hitherto been unbelieving, when they saw this, they believed on it. But others went to the Sanhedrin. And the chief priests and the Pharisees, that's the Sadducees and the Pharisees, gathered a council, that's the Sanhedrin, and they ask an amazing question there in verse 47. What shall we do? For this man works many signs. But then they say this right here. What shall we do? For this man works many signs. Folks, there's an answer to that, and that is this. It's what I talked about before. You check the Old Testament, and if he's consistent with the Old Testament, you bow the knee to what he's saying. He's speaking for God, but that's not their answer. They go on to say, if we let him alone, the Romans will come and take away, everyone will believe in him. The Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Now, the place may be the temple, very possibly. I just think it means our cushy spot. Look where we are. These are the Sanhedrinists. They're rich and powerful and well-respected and comfortable, and we don't want to lose this. And this is where Caiaphas, and I'll come back to this another time, the high priest, and let me just say that in all of our telling of Passion Week, this is the villain. This is the guy with the black hat and a curly mustache, okay? This is the villain. And being high priest that year, and I'll tell you more about Caiaphas, he insists that he needs to be put to death. And he says, even our own scriptures say that it's better that one die for the people and not that the whole nation should perish. And so there are three consequences of this miracle that I want you to see. Number one, in the green, from that day they plotted to put him to death. Folks, get this. From this day forward, now Jesus is already much despised and hunted, but now he is a fugitive. As a matter of fact, if you see verse 57, also in the green there, it says both the chief priests and the Pharisees, that's the Sanhedrin, that's the most powerful body of Jewish leaders in the entire world. They had given a command that if anyone knew where he was, he should report it, that they might seize him. There is a price on his head. His picture is on every post office in the land, if you know what I'm saying. So from that day on, they determined to put him to death, and he is a fugitive. Understand, in all that we talk about, in the events of the Passion Week, Jesus has to be so circumspect because there is an APB out for him. He is to be arrested if they can find him in the absence of the multitude. So number one, he's a fugitive. Number two, in the yellow, and I'll pick up on this next week, Jesus no longer walked openly among the Jews, but he went into the wilderness. Now, wilderness there means frontier or border. It's not the Jeshimon wilderness down by the Dead Sea. It's to a city called Ephraim, and it's right on the border between Samaria to the north and Judea to the south. Now, I'll talk more about this, but there is real wisdom and sustained wisdom in this. So he goes to a place, Passover's near. The Jews are not going to go near Samaria, it's dangerous. But there's a city right on the border of Samaria called Ephraim, and he goes there and he waits until he sets out for the Passover. So he's going to tarry in the little city of Ephraim where he is secure. The Jews are not going to come for him there until he sets out to go up to Passover. Thirdly, and this is so intriguing, verse 55, the Passover of the Jews was near. John is informing non-Jewish readers about the way the feast protocols work. And he said, many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. Passover was a pilgrimage feast, and many would come, but if you had incurred any sort of impurity, contagious disease, open sore, whatever, had a baby as a woman, you had to go and submit to the rite of purification. That took a little time. And so before Passover, the city would begin to swell in size with people coming for the purification rites. And then John says this is so delightful. He says, then they sought Jesus. They were wondering, is Jesus coming? And they spoke among themselves. Now, among themselves means they were whispering. They knew that the very, very powerful leaders were angry and they wanted to arrest Jesus, but they were anxious to see him. So they spoke among themselves as they stood in the temple, and they said, what do you think? That Jesus will not come to the feast? So the city is a twitter with the question, is Jesus going to come? Is the Nazarene who called our friend Lazarus from the dead, is he going to come? The whole city is abuzz with the question, is Jesus going to come to the feast? Now, I'm going to stop there. Our time is up, but suffice it to say that to go back to what, that won't work. Hold on here. Let me take you back to the to the list that we were on, that these are events which are going to culminate in the triumphal entry, and thus the Passion Week. And you had that promise that Jesus made in Luke 13, but now some weeks later, he comes to Bethany and raises Lazarus from the dead. And the effect of that is that he's a fugitive. There's a price on his head. He has gone, number 3 here, to a little village called Ephraim to wait, but the whole city of Jerusalem is abuzz with the question, the excited question, what do you think? That the Nazarene will even come for the feast. Folks, we'll pick it up there next time. Thank you so much for being with me. So it's a blessedness to be able to do this, and God bless you. Have a good weekend. And no, wait, see you on Friday. Today's Tuesday. Lord bless.